But no one is called discredited by liberals more often than the inestimable economist John Lott, author of the groundbreaking book, More Guns, Less Crime. Now, Dr. Lott's topic for the evening, and let me get this right, is making up facts about guns. Now, before I introduce him, though, we have a photo up on the board. Our history goes back further than you know, John. That's me in about, I don't know, 1995 or so. I actually printed out your first copy of your first research, Crime, Deterrence, and Right to Carry Concealed Handgun Laws, and Jay Adams and Walt Daniel, and I took it to Elon College, now Elon University, and that is me approaching Sarah Brady. She had done a lovely speech on how she wanted to reduce gun violence in America, so I approached her entourage, and the security closed around her. But before I said, Mrs. Brady, I understand you want to reduce violence. I want to help you do that. And she beamed, and the security guards parted, and I said, I think you need this, and I slapped Dr. Lott's study into her hand. We bring you John Lott, and his topic, again, is making up facts about guns.
Thanks very much. Well, I greatly appreciate the chance to talk to you all again. And there's been a lot that's been going on here. Let me just get this started. And it's kind of fortunate. Paul earlier played a video when Shannon Watts was on CNN, and it kind of foreshadowed some of the discussion that I was going to be having. Just amazingly, within a minute or two, there you had several claims that were being made there that 40% of guns were obtained without background checks, or purchased, he said, without background checks. It's a claim that you would have seen many times over the last year by President Obama. There's finally, after a long time, you would go and have some of the media fact checks point out that here you have a survey, a tiny survey that was done over 2 decades ago that was done before we even had the Brady law in effect. And it wasn't just sales. Most of that, it was actually 36%, were transfers within family gifts or inheritances. And just the fact that somebody would go and just change the terminology from saying a parent gifting or for an inheritance to a child a gun, and somehow call that a gun sale, so as to scare people that somehow unrelated people were obtaining guns, just gave you some idea how far people were willing to go in order to try to make up numbers or claims. In the last couple weeks, the president has gone and made many other statements. He does a 7-minute presentation a couple weeks ago, like 10 days ago. They must have had maybe about 15 completely false statements within that short period of time. And what I thought I'd try to do is to go through some of those and talk a little bit about the supporting evidence that he brings up in order to try to support that. I have to say, I've known Obama for a number of years, maybe about 18 years or so. We both taught at the University of Chicago Law School for a period of time. And he's a true believer. I'm not going to go and use terms like Nazi Germany in the 30s or whatever that people may have referenced today. But is it dangerous for people to go and produce misinformation? Does it create confusion in the debate and make it so that we might adopt laws that are incorrect? Yeah, I think there are real dangers, and real dangers for people's safety. Just go through a few of these things here now. So again, these are quotes that are about 10 days old from President Obama. One thing he mentioned, he said, my biggest frustration has been this society has not been willing to take some basic steps to keep guns out of the hands of people who can just do unbelievable damage. We are the only developed nation on earth where this happens. And just a typical exaggeration in this case. You want to ask the president, is Norway a developed nation? Because in July 2011, ignoring bomb deaths that were there, you had a shooter who killed 69 people with a gun and wounded 110 other people. That's the record right now for a single person killer. How about Germany? I mean, most people may not realize this, but the 2 of the 3 worst K through 12 public school shootings in the world have occurred in Germany, and they both have occurred in Germany since the year 2001. One in Erfurt, Germany, you had 18 people killed. Another one in Winden, Germany, you had 15 people killed. I earlier had done work looking at mass public shootings in Europe from 2000 to 2010, and what you find is that the per capita rate of mass public shootings really isn't that much different than the United States. And you say, well, how can that possibly be? I haven't heard of these things, but you go and you look at these attacks, which are worse than Columbine, and yet how many of you have known about these attacks in Germany? It's interesting, when you have these horrible attacks occur, it may get an hour or 2 worth of media coverage in the United States, and then it disappears. Europe gets much more coverage of American mass shootings than the United States does of Europe. You may not realize, Finland, within the last 4 years, has had several big attacks where 10 people or so have been killed in a university or at a mall. But you wouldn't have known that just by trying to depend upon American media in order to try to understand that. The president then went on and, referring to, apparently, according to the White House, after I called them up, referring to Bloomberg's numbers that came out last week about school shootings, said, and now once a week we have something like this happen. Well, let's just take a minute about these claims that have come out recently by Bloomberg, where he says there have been 74 school shootings since Newtown. We've had this type of argument before. In February, they produced the same type of numbers where they said at that time it had been 44. And the amazing thing to me is how uncritically the media covers these things. Within like 2 weeks, you had well over 2,000 different news stories about it when it came out in February. Basically, none of them critical, none of them going and asking an academic or critic to go and evaluate the type of claim that was there. It was just pretty much put out as received wisdom. And you got very similar positive coverage for a while with this 74, but in this time, at least, you had places like CNN or PolitiFact, amazingly enough, the Daily Caller doing fact checks and pointing out something that I've been arguing for 6 months, that if you look at these cases, it's including unrelated cases to school property. So you'll have an example of a 19-year-old who's gambling about a block off of school property. They get into a dispute over the money that's being gambled, and he gets shot to death. Is it a tragedy that somebody gets shot near an elementary school who's engaged in gambling? Sure it is. Nobody wants that to happen. Or if you have a 43-year-old man who commits suicide at 2 a.m. in the morning near a school or at a school, yeah, that's a tragedy. But these are not the type of shooting incidents that go and terrify parents when you go and you talk about these things. Many of these events didn't even have those types of tragedies, any deaths or injuries occurring. So I'll just show you one possibly better way of looking at this, and that is what's happened to the number of deaths over time. Because you take the 15 instances that CNN claims have occurred since Newtown. Still sounds like a lot. They don't go through, though, and carefully tell you, did people die? Was anybody shot in these instances? And if you look at this, you've actually seen over the last couple decades a fairly significant drop in the rate of people dying from mass shootings on either K through 12 or universities. In the 5 years, because we start getting this data pretty solidly, there's a couple organizations that started collecting this back in 1992. If you look at the first 5 years, you're talking about an average of 26 deaths a year. Obviously, any death is too many. If you look at the last 5 years, even with Newtown, the average per year is about 12. So it's fallen from 26 to 12. That's about a 55% drop in there. That's greater drop than we've had over that same period in time in terms of the murder rates that have occurred there. I don't think people want to go and phrase things like this in terms of kind of what's the bottom line in terms of how many people get killed or injured in these attacks, because it takes away a little bit from trying to exaggerate the fear factor there, I think. Again, one death is too many, and I'm happy to talk about things that can be done in order to try to prevent those attacks that still do occur. But if we're going to have a sensible debate, we at least have to agree on what's happening to the numbers here. I'll give you another quote from the president. But that we are going to put some common sense rules in place that make a dent at least in what's happening. Until that is not just the majority of you, because that's already the majority of you. Even the majority of gun owners believe this. Well, you know, I just showed you a misstatement by the president with regard to the background checks that were there. And, you know, it's not too surprising if people hear those types of claims that they may also make mistakes with regard to what they think the current laws are or not. Well, you look at this, and in fact, you know, you can get some surveys that go and say, do you support background checks on gun sales? And you'll find 80 to 90% of people go and do that. But the question is, what is meant there? It's interesting, if you go and ask people about specific legislation. For example, here's a Pew poll that came out last April that asked people about this particular vote that was before the Senate, asking them, are you very happy to very angry about the fact that the Senate bill was defeated, that didn't go forward? If you look at Republicans, about 51% were either very happy or relieved it was defeated. Only 34% were disappointed that it was defeated. Among independents, more independents were happy that the bill was defeated than were disappointed, 48 to 41. Only Democrats, by a 67 to 22% margin, were on net disappointed as a result of that. And you can see other polls that when they specifically ask them about the actual law that was up there. The other thing that's interesting, if you go and ask people, well, what do you think is going to happen with background checks? Poll after poll shows that people don't believe it's going to have an impact in terms of protecting people. I'll just give you two. In fact, Rasmussen is people are relatively optimistic in this one, saying it would have a benefit. They found, even there though, only 41% believe more background checks would reduce gun violence. From December, a Reason Rupee poll that included background checks in their list, by 63 to 32% margin, they don't believe that tighter background control, quote, they would not be effective in preventing criminals from obtaining guns. And you know, the interesting thing is, if you actually look at the background checks there, there's basically almost no criminals who are stopped from being able to go and obtain guns. When the president goes and says that there are 2 million prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks, the right terminology is that there have been 2 million initial denials. But there's a huge difference between using the term initial denials and prohibited people being prevented. I'll just give you one example. You may remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy. 5 times he was on the no-fly list. 5 times when he went to the airport and tried to board a plane, there was somebody else who had a name similar to him, and therefore he was stopped from flying. Okay, now I assume the president's not going to count that as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying. But that's essentially the way the numbers are counted when they go and do the background check counts that they have here. If you look at the numbers for 2010, they've stopped reporting them this way under the Obama administration. But you could see there were 76,000 initial denials. Only 44 of those were deemed worthy of prosecution, and they got 13 convictions. And if you look at those 13 convictions, my guess is none of you would think these are really seriously dangerous people that are there. They're people that may have made mistakes, didn't realize that they had some covered offense that prevented them from doing it. You know, it's interesting, just a couple weeks ago, less than a couple weeks ago, Mark Glaze, who's just now stopped being the executive director for Michael Bloomberg's Everytown group, had an interview with the Wall Street Journal. And one of the things that came out in there is that he basically admitted that even though they immediately go and push for background checks or these other gun laws after these horrible tragedies, none of these would have stopped them. I mean, anybody who's involved knows that these people who've committed these crimes wouldn't have been stopped by these things like background checks. And I'll just read you what he says. Quote, because people perceive a mismatch in the policy solutions that we have to offer and the way that some of these mass shootings have happened, you know, it is a messaging problem for us, I think. Is it a messaging problem when a mass shooting happens and nothing that we have to offer, again, nothing that we have to offer would have stopped that mass shooting? Sure, it's a challenge in this issue. I'll just give you another example, just how these things get phrased. So if I just go and ask you, are you in favor of background checks on gun sales, it gets a very high rate. People think that should be done. But just a little bit more information, the National Shooting Sports Foundation hired somebody to do an alternative poll, and they just provided some background information. They said a vast majority of guns sold at gun shows are sold through licensed dealers who are required by federal law to conduct background checks before guns are sold. Do you believe additional federal laws like universal background checks are necessary for gun show sales? If you ask it that way, you get 53% no, 40% yes, 7% don't know. Quite a bit different from kind of what you would hear constantly in terms of you know, what we should be doing here. I don't know if I'm going to go through this, but it's just, you know, there's this, the president has this boogeyman in terms of gun groups such as people here having all the money, and therefore that's what's causing politicians to vote the way they do. They couldn't possibly believe the things that they say they believe. And so he says, so if you are running for election right now, that's where you feel the heat from the NRA and gun manufacturers. Well, Ad Age went through advertisements on gun issues, pro and con, and found that gun control organizations in 2013 actually spent about 7.4 times more on television opponents than on television advertising than their opponents did. You know, just this year, the NRA, according to the New York Times, typically spends about $20 million per election cycle. Bloomberg pledging to spend $50 million a year, and Gifford's group is going to spend $20 million this year. So you get an idea, and those are just two of them. I could go on. Literally, there's like 15 of these quotes in just 7 minutes that I could talk about. I'm just going to go through a couple more. Australia just said, well, that's it. We aren't seeing that again, and basically imposed very strict, tough gun laws and they haven't had a mass shooting since. Well, you know, I could go and talk about the fact that they did have a buyback, but gun sales have gone back up again now. The gun ownership rate, that about a third drop in gun ownership when they had the buyback, but gun ownership right now in Australia is pretty much back to where it was before the buyback. So put that aside, because obviously that impacts how one's going to talk about this. But the thing is, you just can't pick one data point. I mean, I could pick one state to go and look at. Different states have had different laws. You want to go and try to look at things systematically. I could look at New Zealand, for example. New Zealand, neighboring Australia, an isolated island nation again. If you look at New Zealand's mass shooting rate prior to, over the same period of time that people talk about for Australia, 1980 to 96, they had 0.005 incidents per 100,000 people. That was actually higher than Australia's, which was 0.0042. After that, both countries have had 0 mass shootings. Well, Australia may have changed this law, but New Zealand didn't. Again, it's what we call cherry picking. It's kind of like I could go and flip a coin 20 times, get 10 heads and 10 tails. Would I let somebody just go and say, well, I'm going to pick 5 tails from that sample and say, it's obviously a biased coin because all 5 of them are heads? Okay? You don't do that. You don't just pick one number. There's a reason why these guys don't point to places like Europe, for example, in these discussions. As I say, Germany has much more stringent laws than Australia has, and yet it's had some of the worst mass shootings in the world. But they wouldn't want to include that in their discussions. What I've tried to do with Bill Landis at the University of Chicago, we looked at all the mass shootings in the United States over a couple decades. And what we found was that we looked at 13 different types of gun laws. And the only one that had any impact on the rate of these mass shootings was the passage of concealed carry laws. There was about a 60% drop in the rate at which these attacks occurred. And there was about an 80% drop in the rate at which people were killed or injured from these attacks. But the reason why you looked at all the states rather than just picking one is because, there's so many things that can change. And if I could go and just pick one state, I would hope nobody would believe that. Now I want to talk a little bit about an example, because I've written some things about multiple studies that Bloomberg's put out. Just want to go into detail about one of these, because it's gotten massive news attention. You probably don't even realize the influence that it's had. Back in January 2013, Bloomberg put out a study basically saying that in '96, there had been an amendment to the federal budget that had restricted money going to the CDC, saying they could not use government funds to lobby for gun control. And there have been lots of claims. Bloomberg's groups claimed that that ended federally funded research, that research has dried up. I mean, I can give you quotes from them, but I'll just give you some of the media things. And basically, they are relying on this original study. Headlines from the Washington Post proclaim, quote, federal scientists can again research gun violence. This is after Obama kind of unilaterally changed the rules. Or gun research is allowed again. With the Start claims that, quote, academics were forced to stop their research at the point of a gun, or at least at the insistence of the National Rifle Association. In April 2013, ABC 2020 ran a segment entitled, CDC ban on gun research caused lasting damage. Or in January this year, ABC noted, quote, in 1996, the NRA successfully lobbied Congress to pull millions of dollars out of government-funded firearms research. This has resulted in essentially a 17-year moratorium on major studies about gun injuries. Well, just to kind of say here, so this was a study by Bloomberg, and I'll just give you one quote from the Bloomberg study. It says, quote, the amendment, the so-called Dickey Amendment, has driven many experts to abandon the field and keep young researchers from taking it up. You'd think that means a decline in the number of articles, right? That seems pretty clear. But the decline in federal research has undermined overall knowledge creation because scholars are highly dependent on federal grants to support their research. I'll just tell you, only about 3% of firearms research in medical journals are funded by the federal government. But in any case, the bill itself, the way it actually read, quote, none of the funds made available for injury prevention control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control. That's all it said. Okay, so how did Bloomberg's people go and measure this? What they did was they looked at medical journal articles on firearms as a percentage of all medical journal research. And they'll point out that the percentage of articles on firearms fell fairly substantially from 96 to 2011 when they stopped doing it. They didn't include the numbers for the year prior to their study where it had gone up a little bit, and it's gone up hugely in 2013. But the problem is they were never saying that the percentage of articles were falling. They were talking about people leaving, not doing research. That means the number of articles. What basically happened is the number of articles on firearms research went up, It's just that medical journal articles and everything else went up even more. That's, to me, a completely different type of claim. And I'll just show you. So, for example, if you just looked at the number of articles, so it was low, growing quite quickly. It's true it didn't keep on growing at the same rate, but it still has gone up a little bit afterwards. And by 2013, it's about double what it was in '96. And if you look at the total number of pages, because they say how substantial are these articles that are there, you find an even bigger increase in the number of pages in medical journals because the average article on firearms became longer. So there was more of them, and the average length became longer. So, if length of articles is related to how substantial they are, then that would seem to go against that claim. So neither the number of studies nor the pages on research have fallen. The average for the length of studies has gone up. Why do we need government funding for research? I've done some of the largest studies that have been done on gun control, I think by far in terms of the most data. You look at a lot of these medical journal studies, they'll have what we call 50 observations. So they look at 50 states in 1 year. I don't know how you pick 1 year to look at, but they do. And so, but when I look at things, people have looked at my books, know that I'll look at all the counties in the United States or all the cities in the United States by year for as many years as that data is available, and try to compare how crime rates change over time in places that change their laws relative to the ones that don't. Well, my concern about government funding is twofold. One, I don't really see the need. It's not like we're building cyclotrons out there. What it is, I would go frequently and have a graduate student. I say, look, if you will work on this with me, I could pay you, but I could save some money, and I could make you my co-author. So why don't we do this? And a lot of the graduate students want a chance to be able to have their name on an article that's going to be published because they want to get an academic job later on. The problem with government funding research is that politicians just cannot keep politics out of who they give the money to. I'm not saying that when they go and give this money, they say, and you'll get this conclusion. What happens is they know the politics of different people who apply, and the people who agree with them politically are the ones who get the funding, and the ones who don't get the funding. There's no reason why we should go and use federal tax dollars to go and subsidize one side's research versus another in this debate, and it's not clear to me why the federal government should get involved at all in this discussion. Paul's video had a little bit of a discussion here between CNN and Shannon Watts. Since he played the video, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but she was asked, is there an example in school shootings or malls or of these public facilities where basically a bad guy with a gun has been stopped in any other way besides by a police officer? Has a civilian used their gun to stop them from committing this crime? And she says this has never happened. And of course, there's laughter here. I mean, I'm sure without any problem, we could go through a long list of things. You look at schools like Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. You have Pearl, Mississippi. You have universities like Appalachian Law School. You have malls like in Salt Lake City, or you have Portland, Oregon that have been stopped. You have churches like the Universal Life Church. I can mention to you shootings on streets in Memphis, in downtown areas in Oklahoma City. Other places, many of them, public shootings have been stopped by citizens with guns. Paul briefly talked about the shooting in Las Vegas. The one thing that I would add about it is that here you have this guy. It's true he died, but he stopped temporarily the male killer there. The female had to go and get a cart, pretend to be one of the shoppers, go around behind him, and then shoot him in the back and kill him. The question is how long that took. I have no idea. But for her to think of the idea, to get the cart, move strategically to go and be behind him, let's say it's 30 seconds. You have people running out. People, you're giving them a 30-second head start then, if even that's all it took, to be able to go and leave the area. everybody, by all accounts, it was a crowded Walmart. Why? Isn't it amazing that with a crowded Walmart, this permit holder was the only person in the Walmart that they were able to go and kill? So anyway, but I just want to go and point out something, and that is, just in the last month, we have been deluged with information about, as we have in the past, about what goes through these killers' minds. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Elliot Rodger, the killer in Santa Barbara. I wonder, have people read this guy's manifesto? You go and read, how many people have read the manifesto? Okay, you go and read it, and several places in there, I'm just going to read you one, he explicitly talks about why he picked a particular place to go and attack. And so here he says, another option was Deltopia, a day in which many young people pour in from all over the state to have a spring break party on Del Playa Street. I figured this would be the perfect day to attack Isla Vista. But after watching YouTube videos of previous Deltopia parties, I saw there were way too many cops walking around on such an event. It would be impossible to kill enough of my enemies before being dispatched by those damnable cops. He's essentially saying, and if you read this, the guy wants attention. He feels he's not being given the proper attention. He wants to kill as many people as possible, but he worries that with multiple police officers there, he'll be stopped because they have guns and they'll be able to stop him. The Moncton, New Brunswick killer in Canada. This is from his Facebook page. I don't know if anybody has looked through this. This guy had a half-dozen comics dealing with gun-free zones on his Facebook page. This is just one of the comics that he had. So he has a civilian who's being attacked by a criminal here. He says, but wait, there's a gun ban in the city. You can't do this. We have passed a law. It's supposed to be all rainbows and unicorns from now on. And of course, the criminal is basically thinking, what a moron. While he has his gun in his back and maybe getting ready to shoot it, know that the victim can't be there. This guy picked a place where he knew civilians around there weren't able to go and defend themselves, and it's something that he obviously was thinking about. There was a case in Rogersville, Tennessee, just on earlier in June this month. So I'm just taking very recent cases. I could give you lots of others. Just reading from the news report there in the local newspaper, said according to law enforcement officers, the teens intend to become the most notorious mass murderers of all time with the highest body count. They allegedly wanted to be famous, and their road to fame would be paved with bodies of their classmates and teachers at Volunteer High School in Church Hill. Authorities say the boys, who are now 16, 17, even studied the 1999 Columbine shooting, correcting, quote, mistakes, end quote, made by those shooters for the purposes of maximizing the number of students and faculty deaths in their planned Volunteer High School massacre. The plan included killing the school resource officer first. Why did they do that? They knew that he could be the one guy to stop them. And so you have a uniformed guard there. The uniformed guards, God bless them, but they have an incredibly difficult job. They're sitting targets there. It's hard to go and be constantly, day after day, month after month, year after year, on your toes in case something might go wrong. And what you end up happen, and it's just not here, but in other cases, that those will be the first guys taken out. The question is, what's your backup plan? These guys aren't stupid. And what do you do at that point when they're not able to go and stop that? Well, I'm out of time here. So, I believe so, right? Okay. I always talk longer. I apologize. You get that when you ask me to do it. I apologize. So you can't claim ignorance on that. So and even then, I've made a lot of cuts from what I would have liked to have said. But anyway, I really appreciate the time here. We've had Nikki's talk and Larry's and Andrew's here. There's so much information that's here, and the question is, how do we go and get this out? Because the media, it's just amazing to me. We can't even get them to go and mention something as simple as gun-free zones. We have attack after attack. My guess is this debate would be dramatically different if even once in a while, when they're going through their checklist of things, how did they obtain a gun? What type of gun was used in this? Often things that are difficult to determine and they make mistakes about. Just once in a while, the simplest thing to figure out is, did the attack occur in a gun-free zone? For the very reasons that Nikki was talking about before, that it serves as a magnet for these types of attacks. And we see the comics and other things here from these killers. If that was mentioned, my guess is the political debate that we have right now would be dramatically different from the way it is. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.